As we enter week 3 of this class, I thought it would be a good idea just to sort of take a good look at kind of the scope of where we're at in this part 1 of the course, and just sort of frame everything that you've been asked to do and that you will do in the next couple of weeks, and to frame it all in some kind of a more cohesive picture for you, particularly since you've got your first exam in a couple of weeks, and I want to make sure that you do what you can and should do to prepare for that as well. So, as I hope you know by now, part 1 of this class focuses on 2 broad areas of learning. One area is relevance of educational research in teaching. So why is educational research important as educators, and how is it relevant to you? How is it relevant to the field? And the other category, which has a lot of small learning outcomes in it, is science and scientific research. And that category, for this class of outcomes, that category addresses a lot of what might be considered scientific literacy concepts. And so, again, it has a lot of learning outcomes, but they're very, very precise and very specific. And had I given you readings that were from a text that presented information about those things, you would read about some of those concepts within the context of a much sort of more dense presentation of information. And again, I'm trying something different where I'm just pulling out the salient information related to specific objectives that I think are important, and I'm having you sort of read and study those within the course notes. So one of the things I'm having you do while you review and study the notes for this part of the class is I'm having you every week do a different set of reflection questions over a different thing, a different reading, a different web experience, just having you think about some of the concepts in your just in your own life. So if you recall, the very first reflection was just you answering questions about yourself. And one of those questions, I asked you to reflect on some variables of interest to you, some educational variables of interest to you personally. Now, that addresses objective 1.11. You'll notice, though, that 1.11 is not going to be measured on the upcoming course exam. It's one of those objectives that's presented in italicized text, and it's presented because it helps provide an informational bridge from some important ideas to other important ideas, but it's not something that I'm going to actually be testing you over. So really, those objectives that are italicized, they really tie the room together, if you know what I mean. So, so they're important but won't be tested. On the other hand, one of the objectives that is touched on when you're doing some of the readings in this text, so in the first section of this text, I'm having you read part of it and then answer some reflection questions on this. And one of the objectives, for example, that's really important is describing how science represents a way of knowing. So that's 1.3 in the objectives. And that's something that is addressed early in that particular readings that you're going to be reflecting on. The Willingham reading that I had you read, Why Do Smart People Believe Dumb Things? That's a great title, I think, for a book on educational psychology. Could also be the theme of what my last Thanksgiving was when we had all the in-laws over. But that's a very long story, and we don't have time for that. But explain what it means to think scientifically is something that is touched on in that particular chapter, although it really sort of brings it to life with a real example. But it too steps into the objective 1.3, describing how science represents a way of knowing and differentiate between science and other ways of knowing. So it really kind of provides some direct examples of that. Then I'm having you look at some of the research that is published on the Edutopia website. And if you're not familiar with that website, I hope you become familiar with it, because it's one of my favorite professional development sites. It has been for a while. And one of the, in every year they present what they think are the most impactful educational research studies according to their editors. And I'm having you kind of review those. And even though I'm not, I don't ask you reflection questions that are really specific to any one learning objective, it lives, the idea of those questions and what I'm asking you to think about lives in the realm of research as a scientific method. So those are the objectives that are there in the set that begin with the number 2. So those reflections, as well as the Virginia Literacy Act reflection, which to me, in addition to other things, asks you to consider what are some dependent versus independent variables, and even extraneous variables, which, to be honest, is later in the class. But it does sort of make those concepts very, very concrete when you consider how you're going to answer some of those questions. So those reflections do tie, in general, some of the learning outcomes. But remember that exam number 1 is going to cover, or measure, I should say, all the objectives that begin with number 1 or number 2 that are not italicized. And so going to the list of objectives for this class is really a really important thing to do, highlighting the ones that are going to be measured on the exam, then going over to the notes, right? Downloading that and identifying which of those notes align with the objectives that are going to be measured, reviewing that, reading through it, trying to understand it as best you can. And if you don't, you can contact me, or you can do some extra research. I put online in the book section access to an electronic book that presents a lot of this kind of information in it. But there's so much more. You could go to Wikipedia to address some of the fundamental concepts. But then if you're curious, well, how exactly are these going to be measured on the exam? Well, it's easy to learn more about that, because you go to the practice exam. And for example, if you look at this the first objective, which is define observation and variable, those two concepts, or constructs, if you will, objective 1.1, and you'll notice that I measure them in the practice exam, and you'll notice they align. First of all, I put the numbers in so you can see how they align with the objectives specifically, but also so you can see, well, how am I going to measure that? If it was just you and me sitting in a room, I would just say to you, hey, what is an observation and what is a variable? How would you define those? And then you could define them for me. But I'm asking, I am translating all the skills that I want to measure into selected response items for assessment. Not always perfect, certainly, but it does but they all of the items ask you to exercise the skill that I'm measuring. It just, rather than defining it, may genuinely be identify the best definition of. But if you can do one, you can do the other. So that's what you should be focusing on. So for part 3 of this class, or week 3, I should say, you have an assigned reflection, and you should be, completing that in the document, and then do the same thing in week 4. You can actually do all the reflections at one time if you want to. If you have time, who knows, maybe there will be a snow day and you'll be able to go through all of those, and that would be fine. You can submit project number 1 in its completion anytime you like before the due date. And again, remember, follow what's on the course calendar for keeping yourself organized with what needs to be done that week and in an assigned week, and whether or not anything is due during that week. So it's all listed in the calendar there. And so, and also, in addition to that, I do, for different parts of the class, I do put up videos that provide some information and elaboration on the information and examples that you're being asked to process for different parts of the class. So you'll be checking on those, and those will be assigned, and they will be unveiled as the course unfolds. So that's how you should be going through this course and what you need to focus on in the coming 2 weeks.